to you. Good morning, friends. And today we will have an interesting talk by Matthew Riddle, who has titled his talk, A Christian and a Conservative. So, when you're ready, Matthew, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you very much for the invitation to join you this morning. It was through Christine Wilmore, who I know very well, who lives over in Yate. And I live between Thornbury and Albury on the power station road down to the nuclear power station. So not far from the river and not far from Thornbury. It's a road that's been very busy over the last 50 years, but the power station is now closed in effect from producing electricity. So the road is a lot quieter, which is a good job because my front door is only 5 meters from the actual road. I've lived in my area, the Thornbury area, the Severn Vale area, all my life. And I had to think, but not think very long, whether it should be a conservative and a Christian, the title, or whether it should be Christian and a conservative. And it didn't take me long to realize that my allegiance mostly is to Jesus. And it's an interesting, I always think it's very interesting when politics and faith meet. And in a way that they both trying to do the same, in their own way, the same thing. It's about deciding what we do in life and what we do in life. So I always find talking about Christian things and politics a very interesting conundrum, and a knotted conundrum at that. I'll just give you a little bit about my life, because actually what we are primarily or initially it is governed and molded by how we grow up, at the environment where we grow up. And then obviously as we become older, we become adults, we then have to decide for ourselves what we are, what we do in life. I grew up in a very rural area at Albury-on-Severn. Interestingly, both my grandparents, one grandfather worked on a farm as an agricultural labourer. And interestingly, he actually worked on my other grandfather's farm. My other grandfather actually owned a farm, and he was quite a prosperous farmer. But what was the local link, the sort of link that they had between them, or what they had in common, was first of all, they both served in the First World War, and fortunately they both survived that. And secondly, they were both conservatives. And I find that an interesting thing, that both my grandfathers were conservatives, but from very different backgrounds in the sort of society that was then around, 100 years ago or whatever. So I was born into a Christian family. I went to the little church on the hill at Albury-on-Severn all my life, St. Rilders. I don't know if any of you know St. Rilders Church. It's perched up on the hill there at Albury and looks across the River Severn. And I've always worshipped there. And then when I left, well, when I was at college, I went to Devon for my agricultural training. And it's an interesting time of life when you leave home. It's a bit like when a bird pushes out its youngsters out the nest and they're on their own. And you have to decide really for yourselves then, away from family influences, what is important in your life. And I'm pleased to say that I carried on my Christian worship in Devon. And also I was then a farm student in Berkshire for a year when I was about 18. And again, I carried on my Christian worship, my Christian pattern of life. And I really believe that, looking back, that's really helped me in my life since then, having that first of all, been fortunate enough to be born in a Christian family, but also having been pushed out the nest, that the faith was real, it was personal, and I was able to carry on with that faith, in effect, in my own right. But I am quite open. I then got married in my 20s, and as well as worshipping at Albury, it was the C of E church there. I also started attending an evangelical church at Ost, and again that gave me a different form of worship to what I had been previously, and so I still go there with my family today. So we tend to go to Ost in the morning, and then Albury in the evening. But what as you know, what's important in the Christian faith is not just about where you worship, but it's about the other 6 days of the week, in how we conduct ourselves. And my sort of pattern for the day is to wake up, and I try to, but sometimes I fail in this. I try to, as soon as I wake up, even if I've still got my eyes closed, is just to say good morning to Jesus. And I think that's important, that the first thing I think about is Jesus. The second thing, though, is to try and thank God for something in my life that is a necessity. And so I think we can all too easily be influenced by the press, the television, whatever we read every day. Even just driving around, we see billboards of people trying to sell us stuff. And I think, you know, we in our society today, we can become all too materialistic. And I try to thank God for something early in the morning that I need. And invariably, it's only a few things. I thank God for my wife, my children, my car, my house, and the food I'm going to be eating during the day. And I just find that helps ground me really early in the morning with God, and it just helps me personally anyway become a lot less materialistic in my life. I think one of the great challenges of our existence in this life is materialism, and somebody once said that the two great challenges or dangers of our existence in this society today is basically materialism and also communism. And obviously, you know, that was an interesting thing that somebody said once. I don't know enough about communism to comment on that, but certainly materialism is an issue that we have to grapple with in our existence, especially in our Western existence, living in a fairly prosperous country. And then during the day, my wife and I, we do a Bible reading, and we hopefully pray a lot into problems that we have during the day, and we also pray for people who need help at the end of the day. So I do try and structure my day around keeping in touch with God, and listening to what he's saying. In terms of the conservative angle of my life, again, I was brought up in a fairly conservative household, and I've said a lot of my family are conservatives. But again, you have to come to a judgment sometime during your adulthood about what you believe in terms of how the government, how the country should be run. And I've come to the conclusion that the conservative sort of philosophy is the best way that we can run our country. In our country, we are a fairly capitalist country. And I just feel that the Conservatives, because it's more pro that type of thing, that it's probably the best party to run the country. But I would also equally say two things on that. Firstly, that we don't want one party rule all the time. I believe that it's good It's good for other people to try and have a go. They bring in fresh ideas, and that's important for our country, new ideas. I do believe in progression. Although I'm a conservative, and conservatives tend to like to hanker back to the old days and hold on to what they perceive to be good, I'm also quite radical in my thinking. And there are some really good ideas from all parties, I think. And that comes on to my second point about other political parties, that I'm a great believer that no one party has a monopoly on good ideas. I'm a member of South Gloucestershire Council, and I hopefully work constructively across the council with Liberal and Labour councillors. I think it's important that there are good working relationships between the parties on councils. Being on a council is quite a difficult job, really, because it's a pleasurable job, I find, but it's also a difficult job. And I think if you were at loggerheads with everybody all the time, then it makes it almost impossible to do a good job. Because at the end of the day, we are there to represent our residents, our local residents. And I represent, with another councillor, a ward called the Severn Vale ward, which is basically the villages on the west side of Thornbury, between Thornbury and the river. I often joke that a third of the area I actually represent is actually in the River Severn, and that gives me the least problems. Although actually one day that will probably give me the biggest problem if sea rises continue to increase, because that land down against the river obviously is quite high risk of flooding even now, and obviously global warming, and I'm a great believer that there is global warming, and it's partly down to man-made humankind activities. And in a way, it does cut into my conservative philosophy quite nicely, I think, because I'm a great believer in not having any waste. So part of the green agenda is to cut waste, and that for me it really chimes with my spirit, because I don't like to see waste. I'm the sort of person that if I see a bit of wood on the side of the road and it's safe to stop, I'll pick it up. That's a trait I've actually inherited from my father. My father was always picking stuff up off the road that he thought it could be used elsewhere. So in a way, the whole green agenda, I'm very switched on to the whole green agenda. And on the council, I actually serve on the Climate Change Emergency Task Force, which is a standing group in the council. We declared a climate emergency about 3 or 4 years ago, just before COVID hit us, and we're doing a lot of work now as a council to become carbon neutral by 2030. But it's not just about what the council does on green issues and becoming carbon neutral. We're also obviously encouraging other organisations within South Gloucestershire to do the same. So it's partly about leadership. It's also partly about getting your own house in order. So there are lots of challenges going forward in terms of the climate change. And like I say, the area I represent will probably see the impact first, when we get more flooding of the area because of climate change. But I think there's a lot to be said, though, that we can tie that in with just being more careful of using resources, reusing resources, and that type of thing. So I would say that I would probably badge myself as a Green Tory, because I am very passionate about green issues, both locally and nationally. But a little bit more about my background. I actually lecture in agriculture down at Bridgewater and Taunton College, and we basically deliver degree courses from Plymouth University. I only go there about 40 or 50 days a year, But one thing about being involved in education, it does keep you young. Well, I might look a bit off, I might look I'm over the hill, but in your spirit, it does keep you young working with youngsters. And I'm a great believer that actually agriculture, although it actually has contributed to global warming in terms of methane coming from ruminants, sheep and cattle, actually, I think quite passionately that agriculture has got a lot of the answers to global warming, because farmers are land managers, and there are things we can do to the land, like, for example, plant forests, plant woods, not use the plough so much. In my grandfather's day and my father's day, the plough was the king piece of the big piece of kit really on a farm. A lot of fields under arable would be sort of religiously ploughed every year, and actually that's quite harmful to the environment. Ploughing adds too much oxygen to the soil, and that burns off the organic matter, releasing a lot of carbon. So actually what we're trying to do in agriculture now is to use the plough a lot less and drill the crop straight into the previous crop. So and I'm trying this in my garden as well. So I'm not just preaching it, I'm also trying it in my garden. It's called no dig gardening. It sounds very attractive because you don't dig. You just basically plant the plants into the old stubble, into the old parts of the previous crop without moving the soil. So I do believe that agriculture actually has a lot of the answers to global warming, as probably also contributing through the keeping of ruminant livestock. So that's my sort of take on life in a few minutes. I'm always up to challenge. I do reflect. I do a lot of reflection. I think that's important as we go through this life, that we reflect on what's happening around us. We reflect on what people tell us, and we observe, and we just reflect all the time on what we're doing and what we're thinking as well. So I'm a great believer in reflection. As well. So there is a time to be quiet and just reflect, I think, in one's life, and that's almost important as all the rest of the things that we do. So Ray, hopefully that sort of might start a bit of a conversation now. I'm very happy to take questions as well on anything that I've said or anything anybody wants to put forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. I now would like to open the floor open to questions and comments, friends.
Yeah, great. I was thinking as you started talking, Matthew, that we're kind of treading on holy ground discussing politics. There was a joke where somebody shouted out at the party, "Rape!" and then said, "Religion, art, politics and economics, the four things you shouldn't talk about at parties." We're leaping into politics to see where we can get to, and I'm mindful. I grew up in an agricultural area that was traditionally conservative and picked that up, was converted to Labour by a very sassy young lady at university who came from the Welsh valleys, and have since voted Lib Dem and Labour, been a Labour election agent, and been a candidate for the Natural Law Party. So I think I've covered almost the whole spectrum, apart from the monster raving loony party, which some of my family would say I represent anyway. Do you think that, so that's a sort of question, you're sort of following on conservatism from a family background. And my feeling is, well, which party would I ally with? And it's sort of, well, the one that I think is going to get the most done. So if I was in a Labour stronghold, maybe I would vote that way and so on. I wonder if you've got any views about that, especially since you already said about cross-party working.
Yeah, Yeah, that's a very, very interesting point. I mean, obviously I'm elected as a Conservative, and therefore I do represent a Conservative area. And my first comment about representing a Conservative area, people just have have as many problems. They might be very different problems, but they might just as well, or just have as many problems, as much heartache perhaps, as any other community. That's my thinking. So don't think that just because I live in a fairly prosperous, leafy part of South Gloucestershire, I haven't got any roses around my porch, but don't think that people haven't got problems. People do have problems, and you know, it's and I think part of my role as a councillor is to be a servant to them. In the and I don't try to make this too strong, in the way that Jesus was a servant, so the servant king. But I think service is very important, and I do try and help everybody who's got a problem. I had a gentleman this morning whose wife nearly had an accident yesterday, pulling out of her house in the car. So I'll have to go and delve into that problem and see if I can help. So I do see a lot of my role isn't necessarily as a councillor anyway, isn't necessarily about driving a Conservative agenda, but it's about trying to help people wherever they live with any problems. And you are quite in a special place as a local councillor, in that you do get told stuff that is quite personal to people sometimes. And it can affect some of the stuff I hear. It can affect me quite strongly as well. So I take your point about the area where we represent, but I think the problems, there might be different problems, but there's certainly a lot of problems that and people have needs wherever they live. And as one of the sort of councillors, one of the not figurehead for the figurehead's sake, but one of the notable people in the area, people know that they can come and see me or speak to me, and I try my best. And I think that's true of all councillors, whatever they are on South Gloucestershire Council. I just feel that the Conservative philosophy, and of course, when you talk about Conservative philosophy, it gets a bit blurred, because it depends on who the Prime Minister is at the time and what the party is doing nationally at the time. And you could also argue that the Conservative Party is quite a broad church as well, excuse the pun. So it's not just about driving I don't necessarily on the council drive a political point of view, because the reason why I think I'm a Conservative is I like things run properly, and I just feel that Conservatives can run things better than other parties. Having said that, I think there are some really good ideas from other parties, both on the council and also actually nationally as well. There's some good ideas from across the parties. A good example locally is that we just did our budget. So I expect you've all had, well, those of you who live in South Gloucestershire, you've all had your council tax bills come through your post recently. If you don't live in South Gloucestershire, you still have a council tax bill. And we, during setting that rate, we did actually take an idea from the Liberal Democrats actually on climate change, which we were then able to incorporate into our budget. So I think people like to think that politics, and we're subjected to this every day, that politics is all about one massive fight between people, between different ideas. But in the sort of political realm that I occupy, it's very much less than that. It's just just sharing ideas between the different parties locally, and seeing where we can accommodate other views. So I think, and this is one reason why I try to actually listen to a lot less news these days. I used to watch a lot of news every day, and I feel now that I'm only watching the news once a day, I feel a lot happier. it's something about, you know, we have to be careful I think we do have to be careful what we watch and listen to on television, on radio, because we can all become too depressed by the way that politics is portrayed, and it's very confrontational at a national level. I don't necessarily see that though at a local level. I don't know if that answers your question, David, but it did spur me on to say a few other things.
Yeah, it's good. Thank you. It's sort of it does add to it, and I'm also want to pursue a little bit your green thinking, because in Bristol we've got we had to look a little bit hard to find somebody who could represent Conservatives in our discussion group, and that's partly because if you look at the political map of the country, Bristol's a little sort of red island in a sea of conservatism, but actually Bristol itself is kind of half green now. It's got as many green councillors as Labour ones, and there's a joke that comes from Frome where they elected a bunch of independents, and the leader of the independents said, well, actually we're a watermelon party, meaning independents for Frome. We're red on the inside and green on the outside. But I think that environmental thinking is a place where a lot of ecumenicism comes together, you know, because everybody cares about the environment. It really doesn't matter about political ideology so much as what are we going to do to help make things happen. So I'm sort of interested in your rural perception of how we tackle climate change, because Bristol took the lead in declaring a climate emergency, but rural counties and councils have been just as quick to take that up.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, David. It's an area where we can all focus. Everybody I speak to on the council, whatever colour they are, very passionate about green issues, and it was portrayed to me like this by somebody once, not so long ago, that, you know, our house is on fire now, basically, and we need to have more urgency on this issue. Unfortunately, perhaps, and sadly, that wars in a foreign country and other things that happen in our society do take the sort of focus off that bit in the media. But I think every party is really passionate about green issues, because in a way you can look at it in a number of ways, actually, because if we can actually produce more energy in this country, that is good for jobs. So it is good for the economy if for example, we could produce more of our energy. And we are, I think, ideally situated as a country. We're a very windy country. Yesterday, my bin got blown over. Actually, the wind was so. My wheelie bin got blown over because it was so blowy. And obviously, we live in a very tidal country. I'm very aware of that, living next to the River Severn. And we've got a lot of innovation. We've got a lot of brains in this country as well that can put some of these things together. Interestingly, Albury, where I live, is being shortlisted, one of 5, to host a new prototype nuclear power station called the Fusion. I think it's Fusion, or is it Fission? I always get the two mixed up. It's where you put atoms together rather than try and split the atom. So it's a new type of nuclear power station. Might come to Albury. They've only got it to run for about a minute, I think, so far in the whole world, but things look good actually on that. So I think we have got a lot of good brains in this country, and we're also very nimble at once we get an idea, we're very good at developing it. I think, you know, in terms of scaling up and innovation in this country. So I think generally in the country, we are well set up to provide some of the answers. Of course, the conundrum that we've got as a country, I think, is that other countries can point the finger at us and said, well, you started all this. 300 years ago in the Industrial Revolution, burning all this coal and charcoal, etc. So I think we do have a responsibility globally to share some of these ideas, because there are countries now, developing countries, who are perhaps in the same situation as we were 300 years ago, burning a lot of coal. And obviously we in this country are only a very, very small contributor to climate change, compared to, say, for example, China, where they seem to be building a new coal-fired power station every week. So I do think we do have a moral responsibility in this country to lead internationally on climate change, because it basically everybody could point the finger at us and say it was us that basically started it. So it is a really good, I think I agree with you, David, it's a really good topic where all political parties are signed up to it, and all political parties are very passionate about green issues. And for me, coming back to what I've said before, I just don't like to see waste anyway. So it's sort of in my genetics. I think it's been bred into me that I don't like to see things wasted.
When Britain was, well, Britain was in the EU, there was what could be classed as farm subsidies.
Yeah.
Now they don't. Now we're not in the EU.
Mm.
This seems to be a bit of a touchy subject at the moment, because as far as I read about this in most newspapers, that this is a subject which still bedevils the government at the moment.
Mm. Yes, that is a very interesting point. You could argue, and this is where it's quite interesting as a conservative on this. You could argue that farming should not receive any government support at all. And I think, off the top of my head, it receives about £3 billion a year across the 4 devolved governments. So it's not a lot of money. Before we came out of the EU actually was changing its agricultural policy anyway. And I won't go into the detail of it, but I expect you can remember the wine lakes, the butter mountains, and the grain mountains that were produced in the 1970s and 1980s. And the thing about those mountains and those lakes was that we were basically producing too much food in Europe, and then selling it onto the world market, basically flooding the world market with food, which actually did not help farmers in the developing countries, because world food prices were kept very low because we were dumping all this surplus onto the world markets. So actually subsidies can actually be subsidies for farming in our countries and European countries can actually be quite damaging to farmers who are struggling to make a living in developing countries. I'm glad to say that the EU, before we actually came out, had started to change the way they support farmers, and it was more directed about farmers doing things for the environment. Because obviously farmers not only produce food, but they're also land managers. They manage the countryside. And so I'm pleased to say that before we came out of Europe, things were already changing, so that farmers were being paid, but they had to provide certain standards in the way they looked after the countryside, which was much better than paying them to produce as much food as they can, and which often damages the countryside. So I would say that before we left the EU, things were already changing. Now, the opportunity for coming out of the EU is that we can now pick up that direction of travel and be faster. We can get a faster direction of travel on that issue of basically not paying farmers to produce food, although they will carry on producing food, but also paying farmers more for what we call public goods. And the government's mantra since we came out of the EU is basically public money for public goods. So farmers will still get paid about £3 billion a year, but they will have to do even more things for the environment. And that could be things like, quite radical things like rewilding. So you're still farming your farm, but you basically allow wildlife and trees to take over more of the area. Now that will help the environment. You could also say that it's going to reduce the amount of food we produce in this country. Well, it will, and we will be more reliant on imports of food. But that all helps, I think, the farmers in the developing areas, developing countries, because the food prices, the world food prices, are increasing, and that should help them, and it should help farmers here. So I think we went through in the 70s and 80s a very, very bad PR. Farmers did. We were getting money basically to become more intensive farming, use more fertilizers, more chemicals, more pesticides. But now the new direction of travel is to pay farmers to really become managers of the countryside. And it's not just about planting more trees, planting more hedges, it's also about water management. You would have seen some quite, and this comes back to global warming actually, you would have seen some quite frightening newsreel of where some cities get flooded. Like I think it was Hull a few years ago. Hull, the centre of Hull was absolutely decimated by flooding. And one of the ways that farmers can get money now from the government, or will be very shortly, is to actually hold water on their land and allow it to go into the rivers much more slowly to try and stop flooding of cities. So that's another good example of where farmers will be paid for public benefits, not necessarily just to provide food. Just as an aside to this, I actually voted to stay in the EU. I thought that we were, but not very passionately, but I thought we basically had the best of both worlds. We were in the EU, but we weren't in the euro, and there's a few other things that we weren't in as well. So I thought we were quite well placed actually in Europe to stay, but obviously the majority of people that went to vote voted to stay, voted to come out. And I think interestingly, it does show that we should never have a referendum again in this country on any subject, because referendums I think are bad ideas, because they're often trying to decide very complex issues, but with a yes or no. And I think we vote for our MPs. We elect MPs to make those decisions after consideration. And I don't think we'll ever have another referendum in this country again. So that's my view on Europe.
It's a good one on the referendum point, and I'm thinking that we're having a good dialogue here, and a good dialogue actually depends on having different points of view, so you get that energy, but a willingness to listen rather than to make being itching to stab my point and strike you down. And I'd agree with you on the danger of referenda, but I would counter with the suggestion from Extinction Rebellion, which is that we deepen democracy through citizens' assemblies, and instead of having simplistic, here's a few points, let's fight over it. you're able to go into it in depth. And Bristol held a citizens' assembly that was initially going to be about climate change and became about COVID recovery. But they split the group into three and said, what about the climate? What about transport? What about quality of life? And the Citizens' Assembly, instead of voting yes or no, it came up with sets of recommendations in 8 areas, which were in 3 areas. I mean, about 6, 8 or 10 recommendations in 3 areas. And some of them were fantastic. And I mean, it became irrelevant to think what party were these people from. It was that they had brought people together, had the chance for a lot of expert input, and then in a well-facilitated group, discussed and voted on what they wanted. So I think that's the sort of, hopefully that might be the way of the future, where instead of you divide people along party lines, you bring people together around themes and being informed on the topic.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I suppose the pushback on it, though, is if their recommendations are going to be carried out, there will need to be a sort of a political blessing on those. Otherwise, you could then argue who decided who sits on those bodies. So I agree very much with the thrust of it, but I think there's a bit of detail needed about who's going to sit on these and who decides who's going to sit on these bodies. But you're quite right. To just allow time for people to have time for informed debate is so important, because we mustn't make policy on the hoof, which I think we probably do in this country a lot, actually, making policy too quickly. So there is a bit of a conversation about who sits on these bodies and who decides who sits on these bodies, and then at the end of the process, what happens? Some political machine, whether it's a council or a government, then would have to take these up and decide to go with them. So there's a bit of politics either end, perhaps. I don't know.
Yeah, I think you're completely right. And this is where we could lock horns if we wanted to, and I don't want to at the moment. But there's on the green side, there's an interesting program called Black Oil, which from BBC Scotland talks about the country's shift from coal to oil and gas, and then away from oil and gas. But we actually have we've got written into our legal agreements at the moment that the government is legally required to maximize its income from oil and gas in the North Sea. And if we did do that, we would lock in enough global warming to, well, and that's the other thing from the IPCC. The scientists are now saying, look, we lied to the governments because we liked our jobs. And we said we could limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. We all knew that wasn't possible, and that's going to be worse than you thought. And if that's true, then your constituency is going to have an interesting time, as you said, because the Greenland ice cap's going to melt faster than we thought. And that, just the Greenland ice cap, is a 7-meter sea level rise, not 25 centimeters, which is what Bristol City Council is planning around at the moment. So 7-meter sea level rise, that's, I'm at 10 meters above sea level right now. So I'm going to have the water lapping around my estate.
Yeah. And you're quite right, David. We often think that the flooding in our area is going to be on the coast. Well, actually, it's going to be the centre of Bristol as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
As you've unmuted, Graham, I presume you wish to say something.
Yes, thank you, Ray, and thank you, Matthew. You've made the point which coincides with my experience that politics at a local government level is much healthier than what we see on television happening in Parliament, where the media is automatically attracted to prominent politicians hurling abuse at one another, whereas you put the emphasis on cross-party consultation and getting things done. If you lived in Bristol and had to vote on May the 5th on whether Bristol should retain a mayor who appoints a cabinet, bypasses the council very largely, and gets things done without infinite red tape and bureaucracy, would you vote to retain a mayor or abolish it in favour of decisions being made by the council and perhaps taking a little bit longer?
I would actually, if I lived in Bristol, vote to scrap the position of a directly elected mayor and go back to having a leader of the council. Because I think that did serve Bristol quite well over many years. The thing about the leader of the council model compared to the directly elected mayor, I think that the leader of the council model with a cabinet is more grounded in the local issues because of the contact with the local councillors. I'm a great believer that even in South Gloucestershire, we're a very diverse area. I mean, we've got quite a lot of farmland, countryside. We've got a lot of urban areas as well in South Gloucestershire, and they've each got their own challenges, they've got their own problems. And I just think that a leader of the council model would be better than a directly elected mayor. I think that they'll just be more grounded. Now, if we went back further, before Bristol had a leader of council and cabinet, a lot of the decisions would have been made by committees. But I also think that is not a brilliant idea either, because committees, the committee system, I believe, is quite a slow process. I know everybody is involved in a committee system of governance, but I think the leader and the cabinet model is a good medium, a good halfway house, a good compromise, I might say, than having the two extremes. Now, in South Gloucestershire, we've only experienced a committee system. Then we went to a leader and cabinet. Then we decided to go back to a committee, and now we've gone back to having a leader and a cabinet system again, for the reason that I don't know about the Bristol's finances, but actually in South Gloucestershire council is responsible for about £500 million worth of spending each year, and that is a sizable business, if you want to put it in those terms. And I don't think that spending £500 million worth of money every year, I don't think the committee system is the best system to do that. So I would always favour the leader and the cabinet. And the thing about the cabinet system is you've got obviously the leader of the council running the cabinet, but you've got specific councillors who are then responsible for those portfolios. And they're able to become very well read up and informed within those portfolios to make certain decisions. So I would, to come back to your answer, Graham, I would vote against. I would vote to go back to having a leader of a council rather than a directly elected mayor.
You wouldn't change your mind if the current mayor and cabinet were all members of the Conservative Party?
No, I wouldn't. Based on my experience in all I can do is base my experience on South Gloucestershire, is that a council leader and a cabinet is the best way of governance for these types of councils. And Bristol is not dissimilar to Gloucestershire, South Gloucestershire. I think you are you twice the size of South Gloucestershire, something like that? It's but it's still very big. South Gloucestershire is a big council, so is Bristol. And can I just come on the back of that, say this, Graham? It's a pity that I think some people actually who live in the urban parts of South Gloucestershire, some people don't know whether they actually live in Bristol or in South Gloucestershire. And it all comes back to the local media, because when anything happens in South Gloucestershire, they often say it's happening in Bristol, when it's actually not.
One comes onto that tricky thing of dividing up your areas, which sometimes gets accused of nearly gerrymandering.
Mm. Yeah, you mean in terms of wards, do you think, or in terms of councils? Yeah, in terms of wards. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I agree. Yeah, I agree with you. That is a consequence. That's the sort of the bad side of politics, I think, really.
Yeah.
There's too much emphasis about where lines are drawn. It has to happen because populations move around. Some places get bigger, some places may get less people living there. So for democracy to be credible, and this is what the government, well, not the government, this is what the Boundary Commission are doing at the moment with the parliamentary constituencies. They're trying to make them each of equal sizes, because in this country at the moment we've got certain constituencies over 100,000 and some are only 50,000, which actually is not a fair system if you're going to have different size constituencies. But you're quite right, Ray. The sort of political angle of this is to try and get an advantage for your party by drawing the boundaries in a certain way, and it happens locally, it happens nationally. But it is the human side of politics, I suppose, or the bad human side of politics.
Yeah.
I mean, one way of doing it is just allow the Boundary Commission to do it without any public consultation. That would be the other way to do it. Quite radical, but I am quite radical in my thinking.
That's I can. Yes, you've come across as that way. Any other comments, friends? Any other comments from you, Matthew?
Well, I also just as one of my I haven't got many hobbies because I haven't got time. But one of my hobbies, well, my only hobby really, is I make a drop of cider.
Ooh.
And so I got to know the late Peter Grudgings very well, who was a great Quaker in our area. I don't know if any of you knew Peter, but
Yes.
I go there every year and pick his apples. Although he's no longer with us, his widow is still with us, Jean, and I take apples from there, from his orchards, which he planted, and he was a great man. So I do make a drop of cider. I'm actually myself, I'm almost teetotal. I ought to say that, but it's a tradition that we've always had in this family of making cider. We've got a small cider orchard here, and we've got a cider press and a cider mill. So we're set up to make cider. So that's basically what I do for my hobby. Grow the apples, go to the Grudginses to pick up apples, and hopefully make some half decent cider for people. So that's my other part of my life, growing apples, growing apple trees, and making a bit of cider. So there's a plug now. If you're ever in my way, do call in and come and see me.
Or a bit of cider.
For those that do drink, I will give you a glass of cider.
Thanks. So whereabouts?
No, honestly, if you're ever in my area, do call in.
Whereabouts is that exactly, Matthew?
Yeah, it's on the road between Thornbury and Albury, and it's about halfway down,
Right.
just before you get to the Thornbury treatment works.
Right. So there's a question, you know, given sea level rise is a possibility, what do you think about the wisdom of planting nuclear power stations on the coast?
Well,
Given Fukushima as well.
yeah. Actually, that is one reason why people want a nuclear power station in Albury, because that way we would get very much better flood defence banks in this part of the river. So it's an interesting one, because the flood risk normally for domestic, I think it's for domestic and for commercial property, is about 1 in 200. Yeah. If you understand flood risk, it's about 1 in 200. For a nuclear power station, it's 1 in 10,000, 1 in 10,000 years. Yeah. So which means basically that the defences have to withstand a 1 in 10,000 storm, 1 in 10,000 year storm, rather than just a 1 in 200 year storm. So actually, if it does come, this nuclear power station in Albury, it will actually bring quite a benefit to us in terms of better flood sea defences.
Strangely, so there's a big debate, which is cross river. I won't say cross party. I call it cross river now. Just a moment. Sorry, my phone just kicked in. Thought I was giving it instructions. There was discussion about a barrage way back, with the idea that that would be just about generating energy, and the barrage got kicked into touch at the exact time, you know, on the same day, and for the same reason that Hinkley C came in instead. It was a barrage out and Hinkley in, whereas now the debate is shifting to, well, you get energy from a barrage, but actually what you get is sea level defences for the entire Severn Basin. So that might be, so we might have a different dialogue, and it may be that you end up turning the whole area into a real powerhouse, because you have the potential for a barrage, you have the potential for wind built on the barrage, right across the Severn, and the potential for nuclear, which not my favourite, but if it happens, the new generation of nuclear power stations sound safer and less weapons oriented. So
that's a very good point about the Severn barrage. There are downsides to the Severn barrage. Obviously, wildlife would have to adapt, change, move, for one thing. But I'm a great believer that you know, wildlife does hold a vacuum, and it soon comes back after you've done something to an area. The other issue the other problem for a barrage for our area is that the inland water drainage is dependent on the tide going out quite quickly. So they'd have to make sure that, I'm not saying no to the barrage, but they'd have to do some work just to see how a barrage would affect the inland water going out at the river, out into the river at low tide. So it's I think the ones that they were promoting over on the southeast part of Wales, which was more of a
lagoons.
Lagoons, that's the word I'm looking for. Yeah, lagoons, probably, and they could actually be built using gravel from the river, from the Severn, well, from the bottom of the sea. So you wouldn't have to import a lot of new aggregate to build them. I thought I'm surprised that that idea was chucked out, because that did seem to have legs, actually, these lagoons, didn't it? I thought, anyway.
Room for lots of good discussions. We're going to have the sea level rise almost certainly, so we need to be thinking more and more on this in the next years.
Well, friends, we are now gone past 12, so unless there's any questions or comments, I think we now call it a day.
Well, we normally announce what the topic is for next week.
That's the topic for next week. Is your good self, David?
That might be why I'm reminding you.
on the natural law part.
Yeah, we're finishing off the series on politics with a virtual party. I've practiced meditation for a number of years, and Maharishi mused on how life might be, how politics might shift if it was based on natural law. So I'll be presenting a few interesting ideas which we haven't actually put into practice next week. One of those interesting comment you made earlier, Matthew, contrasting capitalism and communism, and or rather materialism and communism, and that was a quote from Maharishi, which was that actually capitalism, and when communism fell, he said, capitalism and communism are not opposites. They're two extremes of the same thing, materialism, which is opposed to spirituality. So, you know, the objective is to get a politics that is, well, you know, we separate church and state. But anyway, we'll talk some about that next week.
Thank you, David.
So thank you, Matthew. Thanks for a really interesting session.
No, it's been my pleasure, and it's great to meet you all this morning, and thank you for joining in the debate.
Great.
I will go away and reflect what I've heard.
Well, we'll finish the meeting. Thanks.
All the best to you. Have a good day. Thank you.
I was here, and thank you very much.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Bye.